Welcome back to the Spiderforest Webcomic podcast. I'm Matthew Moyen. In this episode, the character of the writer. Comics are a visual medium, but without good writing, they're just pretty pictures. In fact, it's been said that good story saves bad art far more often than the reverse. So in this episode, we're going to explore the lessons that pure prose has to teach a comic artist. They're far more profound than you might think. First, Eva of the comic Bits Fair will be bringing us a special interview with Olga Makarova, author of 6 novels and creator of the comic Gifts of Wandering Ice. Then our member Dan Kelly will be back for a discussion with Kat Feete of the comic Sunset Grill, Denise Randall of the comic Gemutations Plague, and Dan Sharp of the comic The Demon Archives. They call them graphic novels for a reason. Stay with us.
Hey, I'm Eva, and I make a comic called Bits Fair. The creator I interviewed for this episode, Olga Makarova, is an author of 6 novels, all published in Russian, and a webcomic called Gifts of Wandering Ice. It is set in a post-Ice Age era of a world that survived an apocalypse. The catastrophe did not turn the Earth into a barren wasteland. It is still a beautiful place, and it is inhabited by kind and intelligent people. And sometimes mysterious ancient icebergs arrive to their shores, bearing gifts from the past, sometimes very dangerous ones. You wrote this story, Gifts of Wandering Ice, as a short story at first.
Yes, it was a very short story, about 6 pages long, and it had only 4 characters back then.
How did you get the idea for the world and the story?
I don't remember exactly. It was so many years ago. I think I saw it in a dream or something. I have many stories based on my dreams.
How did you construct the society that your characters live in? Did you take inspiration from something, or did it all come from your imagination?
I was always very interested in what would a matriarchal society look like. We don't often see them in other stories. So I decided to construct one and observe how people will live there. It's an experiment for me.
Why did you decide to adapt it into a webcomic?
I got curious about making webcomics. It's practically unknown in Russia, and I didn't know for a long time that such a thing exists. I was fascinated by the genre, and I wanted to try myself in it. It was supposed to be a 20 pages comic, but it turned out to be very long. It's very different from writing a novel. There is a part in my comic, for example, where 2 people are telling their stories, and in a novel I would have to write them one after another, and in a webcomic I can just divide page into 2 parts and tell both stories simultaneously. I really liked that part. So it's different, but in a webcomic you can do many things you cannot do in a novel.
I tend to be really jealous of prose writers because they can write the story really quickly and get it out there really fast, and when you draw a comic, it takes such a long time to draw it page after page and panel after panel.
Yes, but it is easier for readers to understand it, and it's much easier to translate. My English is not perfect. I cannot translate my novels into English, but I can translate a comic. It has less text and more pictures, so I have more readers this way.
A short story is read all in one go, and a webcomic is read 1 page at a time. So did you find that you had to change the way that you paced the story, or had to switch from the way you think as a novelist to the way you think as a webcomic creator?
I should be rewriting the story to make things happen faster. I don't do that, so it's more like it would be in a novel. I think I lose a lot of readers that way. many people say it takes too long and they wish to see more action, events changing quickly, but I don't know. I think it harms the story in my case. I always think of a story as a whole, so I think it's more focused on people who would read it in one go.
Do you read webcomics yourself?
Yes, I read Marvy Internal and The Myth, The Unsounded, and All Human Star, and several others I check on from time to time.
Do you find that you read more the ones that tend to be really fast-paced, or the ones that are paced out more like a novel?
I like the ones that are paced more like a novel. I'm a very bookish person, I guess.
Hey everybody, we just had a great interview there with Ewa and Olga about her short story turned comic. I'm your host, Daniel Kelly, author of Saffron Sage. I'm here with three of our own Spiderforest creators. First off, we have Denise Randall. Can I get an A?
Hello.
Up next, we also have another guy named Daniel Sharp, creator of the Demon Archives. Daniel, can I get an Ayo?
Heyo, I'm the real Daniel.
No, you're not. And our last person is Kat Feete of Sunset Grill. Kat Cavan, Umdalai. So just to pick a name out of a hat, Lesser Daniel, what you think? What do you think of...
that's harsh.
Yes, you got in the chat secondly, so I got to pick Daniel Prime.
Harsh.
So what do you think about the difference between webcomics? Let's just start with you.
I'm the writer for my comic. I don't draw at all. And so it started actually in a creative writing class in undergrad where I was writing it prose. I was writing it as a novel. And at some point, I decided that it would be really fun to turn it into a webcomic, hired an artist, and so I've made the transition. I'm like, I don't write very much prose anymore. And so I liked the interview because it was like Olga had like the same sort of thought process, and she's doing an apocalyptic comic as well. So, I mean, what's not to like? We're the best.
What about you, Darwin? What do you think of the interview and about writing between prose and comics?
There's quite a bit of difference between writing a book versus drawing and writing a webcomic. I actually do both. I have two comics right now. The Only Half Saga, which is kind of a post-apocalyptic urban fantasy combination, and then I have my Gemutations Plague, which is a science fiction novel. Some have called it post-apocalyptic, but it's more about the glaciers melting and the sea levels rising and that sort of thing and what happens with the people in it. So both of those started as novels for me, and I was actually convinced by a member of Spiderforest, as a matter of fact, to turn them from novels into comics.
How about you, Kat? Do you have any experience with writing prose before you started doing comics?
Yeah, I actually finished 2 novels before I ever even looked at comics, and was completely failed to finish a 3rd, 4th, and 5th novel due to some writer's block issues. And then my writer brain went, we're going to write a webcomic. And I said, that's a terrible idea. And 9 years later, I'm still writing the webcomic. But I did actually do NaNoWriMo this year and did have 50,000 on a new novel, which I'm hoping to finish someday. So I do both. I do them at the same time. I do them basically for very different reasons, and I've used very different sets. My comic, Sunset Grill, is not based on a novel.
Is it post-apocalyptic like everyone else's seems to be?
No. Well...
Shame.
I think someone described it as urban science fiction. It's sort of like post-cyberpunk. It's the kind of gritty cyberpunk ethic, but it's set about 500 years in the future, and there's aliens, and there's an empire, although they're mostly a bureaucracy. And, that's really why I started writing it. There's a very set structure at the moment for writing novels, and when I got into webcomics in 2008, it was very freeform. There's a lot more now where it's pretty much graphic novels, a lot of long form, but at the time long form wasn't that popular, and there was a lot of space. And I could just sort of diddle around and do this sort of weird slice of life, soap opera-esque, setting-based thing that I wanted to, which I couldn't write as a novel. So that's really what it was about for me. This is a story I couldn't write as a novel.
So let's kind of get down and do a bit of a breakdown. I have a few thoughts. I guess the first thing I kind of want to talk about is the difference between pacing of a novel and a comic, and not just a comic, but specifically a webcomic, because a novel, you usually give, at the very least, an entire chapter to people, whereas a webcomic is something like a page a day, at most, for most webcomics, and most are close to a page a week. How does that affect kind of the writing process when you're writing just one page of a comic and it kind of has to be able to stand by itself?
With a novel, you're really looking at something that people are going to read in a few sittings. They're going to get from the beginning to the end straight away, and they expect it to be kind of a through-running story. With webcomics, you need to deliver something every day, whether it's a joke, whether it's, just a twist, some kind of interesting change. So it's a very stop and start kind of pacing, but at the same time, it really lends itself more to short story kind of thinking, or even to just, brief isolated episodes. And you can kind of spend more time on certain things like a character episode, where with a novel, it's a little harder to play that game, to kind of sprawl out and look at things in depth in a novel, because you've got to have your beginning and your end.
One thing I noticed when talking about webcomics for my own blogs and such and reviewing other webcomics is that there's a lot of long storylines in popular webcomics and unpopular webcomics as well, of course, that when you read them day by day, they can really stretch and feel very tedious. But if you were to go back later, once the story is done, and just read it in a single sitting, it's fine. And that's kind of a challenge I think is unique to webcomics. I think a pretty interesting thing to think about. There's less tolerance among live readers for faffing about than there would be for a novel or even for the comic readers once it's done.
I don't know. I feel I get what you're saying there, but at least when I pay attention to my readers and like the comments below the Demon Archives, they're pretty patient with me, even though it's 2 pages a week. Some weeks it's only 1 page a week, depending on the artist, and we're going at it, months and months at a time. So that means a chapter will last months. And all that has happened to this chapter is in this most recent chapter, we have like a court-martial. And so very little is happening page per page. And I should be better about making sure each page has a hook in it and stuff like that. But I mean, you're not going to please every type of reader. And since webcomics are great in that we have such an opportunity to reach a diverse reader group, that it's not just like a novel or it's not just like a gag a day sort of comic, you can have a long form comic where they're invested in where it's going to be, months from now and years from now as you're writing. I also have readers who will just not read every update and they'll just catch up every month or two and just read a full chapter and see what happened in that chapter. As a writer, it's hard to write it with all of those possible pacings in mind, because you have people who've followed you from the beginning and you've had people who just barely found your comic and they read all 200 pages in like 3 hours. It's hard to please all of them. So I don't know. I try not to worry myself about having perfect pacing.
All of my books became webcomics in some form. So all of my comics that are currently here started out as a novel. So I have found that I have to actually go back through and edit it in a way that it will support the pacing that's required for a webcomic. So I won't necessarily do a gag a day or something, but something's always happening in that page to make sure that the story is progressing. And I will admit sometimes I mess it up, but overall my readers seem pretty pleased with how I have adapted it. And I will be honest with you, I think that writing a comic has actually made me a better writer because it's taught me to be precise and less verbose, not so much flowery description. And that was one of the big mistakes I made when I first started webcomicking, is that it was all data dump.
I think that there is more room for faffing about in webcomics in certain ways than in novels, but it's a different type of faffing about. You can have stuff in a webcomic that doesn't have an essential point to the story, that's just a grace note. And as long as you're delivering lots and lots of small payoffs in a webcomic, then you can keep everybody happy for a very long time. As opposed to a novel where you really have to deliver the big payoff and they need to feel that everything that you've written before that is directed towards that big payoff.
So obviously all of us here were not primarily prose writers, not primarily known as prose writers, we're comic people. So obviously we've chosen comics as our medium for a reason. I thought it might be interesting to talk about the ways that comics are superior to prose, and we'll give prose its due a bit later on.
I've been doing art since I was little, and the fact that I could actually turn around and turn my novels into something graphic was always intriguing to me. I think I had a couple of false starts when I was trying for comics. When I was writing Forgotten Ties initially, I had tried to do a couple of webcomic pages, failed miserably. And so when Kez, yes, I'll give her due, when she talked me into actually starting my webcomic, as soon as I got into it, it was like an addiction. I really had to continue to do it. And I think that's the only reason I've lasted 10 years in this business, is because I like the immediate feedback. I like having people guessing what's going to be happening in upcoming pages, or even giving me feedback on whether the art works for them or not. Those sorts of things have actually helped me improve drastically over the course of the past 10 years. Some of the things I can do now, I could not do 10 years ago. And that's because of the constant practice that I get with the visual medium on these stories.
So for one of me, for the advantage is just in terms of the time it takes to write. Writing prose, writing a novel, you're thinking like it's this huge, big, unending text, you're writing a book. And that for me was actually challenging with my timing, with my schedule. I'm in medical school. I've got 2 kids. I have less time than I would like for hobbies. Probably take more time on hobbies than I should. But writing as the comic, since I have to write for my artist page at a time, that I can break into discrete chunks a little bit easier for myself. So that's like one advantage that I have, is that writing for a comic, writing for a web comic, I set my own schedule, I have my own pace, and it has a lot of flexibility on the creator side as well as for readers, they have different flexibility in how they can consume and read the story. So that's definitely an advantage I enjoy of comics compared to writing out as a book. And then what do I do with a book? How do I publish a book? Do I try to publish it? Do I do it myself? Webcomic is pretty nice. I'm going to have a website. People like pictures. They like to look at it. They can read and hear and digest my story on the internet.
My motives here are very basic. I really hate writing description.
And I was terrible as well. Yeah.
I'm like, it is a room and it is 5, by 10 feet square. It's really bad. And my biggest strength in writing, and it always has been, is writing dialogue. So in certain ways, writing for webcomics really plays to my strengths and minimizes my weaknesses. I do my own art. I actually use a 3D program and do 3D generated art. It's not like the greatest art on earth, but I promise you it's a lot better than my descriptions were. So I'm very basic about that. But it's also been really useful for me. I mean, as a writer, one of the biggest complaints I would get from my critique groups was that I was what they call a white roomer, meaning that there was never enough description. Nobody could visualize my settings. And as I'm coming back into novels, I'm discovering just how much I have learned about presenting a setting from working in a visual medium all the time. And as someone who's writing a science fiction comic, I have to say it's so much easier to do the world building when you can just show them a picture of the funny thing instead of trying to describe, this weird setting with flying cars and, dirty streets and everything else. I can just have a picture. It's fantastic. So I find it a very terse medium, and it's particularly nice for people who are doing a non-standard setting, who are doing something like science fiction or fantasy, because you can just get so much of the world building right out of the way, right up front. Here's your picture. Here's what the setting looks like. Bam.
I'm actually glad that you brought that up, Katz, because that's something I want to talk about as well. In a novel, when writing prose, when you're doing a scene in a location, especially like a less important location that's just there, you're only in it for a couple of minutes, you really don't want to give it too much description because it's just words and words and words of this place. It's not super important. But in a comic format, you can have all this detail and the readers won't get sick of it. You have these big sweeping shots, you have all this background stuff. You can have these background gags that you actually couldn't do in prose because if you wrote it out, then it wouldn't really be a background gag because it's not subtext, it's just literally the text. I find that a useful, cool thing about comics as well.
Yeah, see, I kind of have the opposite problem. Working on webcomics has actually made me better about it, is that I used to be a very, very character-centric person. I would sit there and describe in detail the characters that were within my setting, but the setting itself tended to be very vague. So I found that webcomics have actually taught me to set a scene better, to actually get my background work in there. And it's something that I'm still improving upon even to this day. We have the anthology coming up, and so I've found that I've worked on the background images first in order to get them set before I actually start working on the characters, because I know that's my weak point.
Yeah, I personally had a lot of weakness as well. I felt with the background and the setting when I was writing. But it is kind of interesting that a poorly drawn background can be a lot more obvious than a narrative prose that doesn't focus on setting and description, that's more character-oriented thoughts and actions. And I've read recently great books that don't describe the room every time you enter a room. They're people and they're talking, and that's what's important. But in a comic, it would be very, very obvious if you just have two talking heads with no background. It's different. That has different requirements and different needs that are easier and harder in different ways.
One other thing, too, again, I'll keep on coming back to not just comics, but web comics. And web comics, unlike web prose, or at least unlike any web prose I've ever seen that's done this at all successfully, is this concept of the infinite canvas that can be used often for gimmicky reasons. I had in my previous non-Spiderforest comic, Legend of the Hare, cool parallax scrolling effects, which was more of a gimmick. I've seen people get knocked out of panels into the sidebar. I've seen, of course, there's the most common use, the really tall panel for something falling. And these are just these kinds of tricks. Are these even worth considering as like an artistic thing, or are they more gimmicks?
They're gimmicks if they're not done well. If you're just doing it because, like, look, I have a website, I can do cool things, then I think it's a gimmick. If it's executed well and it is important to the story and to the feeling, I think that it can be powerful. It's a tool. Use that tool well. I haven't personally seen many comics that do seem to use those tools well. It generally ends up being less user-friendly than just clicking next to see the next page. I generally prefer, as a reader myself of webcomics, I prefer that format generally to various websites that have an unending vertical scroll and other things like that. So that might be some of my personal preferences bleeding over. But most of the time I don't see that looking well. But I do have, I guess, in my mind, I can think, like you had the falling example with like that very tall panel where you're scrolling through falling. I've seen that done well a couple times at least.
You end up with these gimmicks or tricks that you use, and you do this in prose writing too. I mean, I was just listening to a really excellent podcast on how you built chapters and where the breaks were, and there was basically their answer was, well, it's wherever you feel like it and wherever, either it's a natural pause or it's somewhere where you desperately want the person to turn the page, or you're trying to give more weight to something that just happened, so you add a bunch of white space after it. I think that stuff like the long fall and infinite scroll can work really well in that same white space way, where if you're making people put in the time, it gives more weight to something that has just happened. I will say that the only time I've done anything like that, I will do extra long pages, and it'll simply be because I'm doing a scene, and like I said, I'm very obsessive about making sure that something happens in each page and something changes. And I will hit these pages where I just can't make something change in the number of panels. So I just add panels at the bottom and keep going until I hit my change point. But I think that's probably because I'm not very good at writing short just yet. I'm still working on my conciseness.
And that is a benefit that you have in the web medium. Because I was just thinking myself, I'm making it on the web, but I have these aspirations of printing it. I have to be like, well, I'd better make sure that each page is the same dimensions because it has to read left to right like as it gets printed. So I can't do any sort of infinite canvas or vertical scroll in my comic because I want to print it, left page, right page, left page, right page.
If I ever print this comic, I'm going to hate myself so much. But fortunately, that would require like this massive investment of free time, and currently, that's just not going to happen. I don't see it happening for maybe when the kid's 10. I don't know. 5 years? That could happen. But then I'll hate myself, but it'll be way too late to do anything about it.
For myself, I actually started out doing longer pages when I first started because Kez actually recommended, hey, you got an infinite scroll. You can do whatever you want to. But the problem became that the bigger the page, the longer it is, the more memory it takes up and the longer it takes to load. For myself, I live on satellite internet, so that tends to be a problem. So even the places that do have the infinite scroll, I have difficulty with because it takes me a while to get them to load properly. So I actually have backed off from those kinds of longer pages and actually reformatted all those early pages that were longer in order to be, like Daniel said, a standard format, even though I have no aspirations whatsoever of ever putting my comics into print. And that's just a self-confidence issue that I don't think my art's good enough to be in print. But that's just me.
Yeah, prose doesn't really have to worry about file formats or, keeping up with standards or doing something in Flash and how it's appreciated.
I beg to differ. I have printed 11 books. They have to be in a specific format.
And one of my favorite authors, his publisher had to figure out how to print a book that big because he's pushing 1,000 pages, and they had to work with the printer to physically be able to do it, make it work.
That's Brandon Sanderson, isn't it?
That is indeed Brandon Sanderson.
Who else could it be but Brandon Sanderson? That's the thing about, pacing and conciseness. If you're writing a novel, you certainly can write the novel too long, and, you'll be going, oh, this is cracked over 120,000 words. I'm at like 140. What am I going to do? And you have to go back and cut a subplot or something like that. Whereas you don't really have that with the comic because people don't, they don't pay attention to how long it is. Even if you're getting it printed, you're just like, yeah, I'll get a longer one printed. But what you do have to pay attention to, of course, is the amount of words on each page and how wordy you are becoming, because people have a pretty negative reaction to overly wordy comics. And that's something that you don't have to worry about in novels. You don't worry about, I've just written a 30-word long sentence. How am I going to cut this up? What am I going to do in a novel?
This chapter has too many words.
Yeah, no, you don't have to think that way.
And Kat also mentioned something I want to call a bit more attention to, this idea that you wrote a book, it's too long, let me go back and edit it. That's really hard to do with webcomics, or comics, because you've drawn the book, and that's a huge time investment. For example, my own webcomic, Saffron Sage, the first chapter has a very awkward transition. That would probably be a lot better if there was an extra page added. That's like a week's work. I'd have to pay an artist $60. I probably wouldn't be able to do an update that moved the comic forward that way, etc., etc., etc. It's a lot harder to go back and write that extra little scene than it would be if it was a prose thing. I could just go back and add 2 paragraphs.
That's, when I said earlier that I would need a lot of free time if I ever wanted to print my comic, that's why. I write in when I publish on the web, I do kind of a soap opera format where, I do this storyline for a few weeks and then I jump to this storyline, and they're constantly jumping around, and I can cut out one storyline and try and print it. But it's going to be really rough, and I'm going to have to render probably 15 new pages just to get that comic in print. I can't do it, Editing a novel is not my favorite job on earth, but I've done it. It takes me about 3 or 4 months to edit a full-scale novel, which is significant, but it's nothing like drawing 10 pages.
I would have to agree with Kat on that, because the hours it takes me to produce a single page, 4 to 6 hours, depending upon the detail of work. And then I can write a single chapter for a novel in approximately 2 to 4 hours. So it actually takes me longer to do something graphic-wise than it would to do the writing for it.
I would also say, as someone else who does do the art and the writing, I do tend to try and do my writing in the morning before my daughter gets up, and then I will be able to do artwork in the evening. It's more time-consuming and in certain ways more difficult, but it uses a different part of my brain. With writing, I have to be 100% there, whereas with the art, I can kind of just be fiddling with smaller details. And so it's a great thing to do because it takes up different parts of your brain. It's been such a challenge and such a fun thing to be writing and be doing art.
We're talking a lot about the speed of production, but if you had infinite time, like it just wasn't an issue at all, would you, just hypothetically, would that mean, would you just do
Naps. Lots of naps.
If you had infinite creative time, would you just do lots of comics? Or would you still do prose even without that, even without a time constraint?
I would still do prose. I mean, I'm just getting back into prose, but there's certain things you can do in prose that you can't do in comics, particularly dealing with the internal development of characters and things. I don't do a narrator at all. I just find the narrator voice awkward for myself. I've seen it done very successfully in some places, but what that means is that the only idea people have of what the characters in my comic are doing is what they say out loud. Whereas with the prose thing, I can often get some kind of character development out of the way very quickly with just a little bit of internal monologue. I can also do more tricks, and I'm learning this with description and stuff like that, with how they see another person or how they see a room, that just fills in for people what this person is like. It's easier to create not a visually more alien world, but an internally more alien world, and a world where the culture has changed more, I think, prose-wise. I'm a science fiction person, science fiction nut, so that's where I tend to think in that direction. So I'd still be writing prose, but I'd use them for different things.
On that topic of strength of prose, I feel that a lot as well. Some of the early chapters of the Demon Archives, like the early pages of the first chapter, I was really struggling with that balance of how much text can I fit on a page. I wanted to have all this dialogue. I was directly translating my prose version of the story through the artist into like a comic, and they were overly wordy. I tried unsuccessfully to have like internal monologues and stuff like that I had in prose that just didn't translate well. And it took me a while to get to where now I can write a page that has no dialogue, sort of thing, and still feel like I'm writing and contributing. And since I can trust the artist, a lot of that comes down to the art to convey all of that emotion and things well, and that can be very difficult. Whereas with prose, it can be really easy to just have your person think liar. Instead, now you have to try to have a face that shows I think that person is a liar. And so that can be really difficult. And I'm glad I don't have to try to draw that myself to make it happen.
I have different headspaces, kind of like Kat in that manner, that there's some days or some hours that I can do prose and I do it very, very well. Usually it's first thing in the morning, like Kat said. And then in the afternoon, when I have more distractions going on, it's much, much easier for me to do art. So I have those moments where prose is what I want to do, and I have those moments where art is what I want to do. And so I actually do a balance of both. I'm one of those people, I've got like 5 million things going on at the same time. I've got one book in edit mode, I've got one book I'm writing, I've got my comic that I'm doing, I've got the pieces that I'm doing for the anthology, all of this other stuff that's going on all at the same time. I'm that kind of person. I have to have 5 different projects going on at the same time in order to stay calm. I know that sounds weird, but that's the way I work.
So following up on that idea, Darwin, that you said about how sometimes you like to do art and sometimes you prefer to do prose, does a story really have to be one or the other? I've seen at least one successful webcomic that actually bounces between them. Some pages are comic pages, some pages are prose pages. Is that something that's worthy of a bit more experimentation that's really getting?
From my experience, not so much, because I know that when I read somebody else's webcomic and I'm looking for that visual, and then I come to a page that's all prose, I find my brain shuts down. And I don't know why that is, because I love reading. I read novels like all the time. But I think because the comics are supposed to be a visual medium and you get to this wall of text, like we talk about wall of text all the time, that I think that becomes a problem because it's not the medium that we're expecting when we get to somebody's webcomic.
Yeah, I think it's all about expectations and for your readers, and you don't want to jar your readers out of the reading experience. I mean, for myself, I am bilingual. I speak Spanish and I translate with medical school and stuff like that for patients. But if I don't know what language I'm supposed to be hearing, I can't understand it. Like, wait, are you speaking English or Spanish to me? Like, I have to know which one I'm listening to. And so I think for comic readers, if it's not done well and if your readers aren't expecting, I mean, if your readers know that you're going to occasionally have a page of prose, then it's probably not going to be as big a deal. But I've had the same thing where I'm reading through and suddenly prose, and it really throws me off.
You know, it's like shifting gears in a car, and I think that shifting from comics to prose is a little like trying to go from first to fifth. I'm now realizing that there are people out there who've never driven anything.
Probably don't know what you're talking about, right?
What's a car?
Just say it would be really bad. It's really bad. The car stops. The engine does a very bad thing. If you learned how to stick shift, you'd know. You know, I do use prose in my comic, but not for the story. So, you know, it's very typical for me to drop some offhand reference to something in the comic itself, like, you know, oh, such and such place or something, and then write underneath it in the notes. That's a reference to this particular imperial colony, which was destroyed in such and such a time, and there was this big, you know, I'll write a huge chunk of world building down there, kind of encyclopedia entry stuff. And people have taken quite well to that, but it's a completely different, you know, there's an expected gear shift in there. You're going from first to second, you know, it's not a huge jump for people to make where they're jumping out of one style of telling the story and into another.
I do a similar thing where since I have the website that I can control, from page to page you don't click next and suddenly it's prose, but there is a section of the website where you can go and you can read lore, you can read world building, you can read short stories and things like that. And it's mentioned in the author notes. And I think that's a good way. If you want to hybridize and you want to write prose and have your comic, personally, I prefer that, where there are separate sections that are linked to and you can connect to, and not you're clicking next and suddenly this is just a page of text.
The one way I have actually, now that I'm thinking about it, made it work somewhat, although this was, you know, a completely different story. I wasn't telling the same story as first comic and then prose, was letters. was writing letters from one character to another. For some reason, that worked quite well.
I could see that working.
Especially if you make it look like a piece of paper.
Mhm.
Yeah, I did. That's exactly what I did. People loved it. I would really like to get back to that if I ever have the time, because people really enjoyed that.
Just go and throw an open call out to anyone else has anything they want to talk about before moving to what they think will be the final point of discussion.
Well, I mean, one thing that it still shocks me, and again, I had this big 8-year period where I was just writing for the comic. I wrote very little prose, except for lore pieces or letters or whatever for the comic, and then jumped back into novel writing. And it was just such a huge shock for me how much I had learned from working on the comic and how much better my prose was because of my comic work.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
And even my dialogue, which I'd always, thought of as my strength and been told was my strength, that need to fit all of your dialogue onto that little page and not have, still have some room for the pictures, you're trying to squeeze the characters in there somewhere. I had just gotten so much more punchy with my dialogue, so much more terse. I understood better what I needed to be conveying about a setting because I had watched people for almost 9 years now picking up on bits of my setting. And so I know what they were looking for now, So it's been such an amazingly cool experience. And I think it's made me a much better prose writer to have written the comic.
One thing I enjoy about writing the comic instead of writing it out as a novel, when I was writing it as a novel, it was the audience of me, and I had some writing group sort of thing, but I'm basically just writing all in advance, and I actually really like writing a page at a time sort of thing to where I can see the reaction and the interaction with my readers, and I don't have to change something, but if they have a cool idea or something they say and they comment makes me think about it, I can now incorporate that, I can think about it and edit as I go as I'm writing sort of thing. And so I really enjoy that aspect of writing it as a webcomic. It's not interactive. They're not voting on what happened next or anything like that. But I enjoy writing in that way and coming up with changes like halfway through a chapter because that's just kind of how my thought process and writing process is working now.
I've used my readers as a barometer to if I'm telling the story well, because sometimes they'll come back to me with questions or speculation about what's going to happen, and I realize, there's a detail here I probably should have included. And so I will actually incorporate that into a following page to make sure that I clarify for my readership what's supposed to be going on or what a character's supposed to be thinking. Beyond clarification, I don't normally allow readership to affect how I'm telling the story.
I think one of the big benefits of having a webcomic, as opposed to the kind of writing in a vacuum of writing prose for, writing for a complete novel, it gave me a lot more confidence. People got so much more. I would always have that moment of, oh no, I need to go back and explain this. They're not going to get this. They're not going to understand this. You're really kind of shouting into a void there, Even if you got published, people don't really necessarily comment on every little thing. And with the webcomic, it's been great because I'll put stuff up going, they're not going to get this. And they get it. It's fantastic. It's just given me so much more confidence in what I can pull off. And of course, when I fail, they let me know too. And that's a good thing to know. It's always good to know when you've completely overreached yourself and are way out of your skill level and just are going to have to somehow make it back to shore. But valuable knowledge.
We've been talking about the differences between prose and comics for about an hour now. So I think now here's a good time to talk about the question of, is this a stupid comparison? Are comics and prose really comparable, or is comics closer to something like, say, film?
They're not perfect comparisons, but I think you can still compare them. They are still comparable. I know a lot of artists, and especially writer artists, when they put together the story, they put it together. You're talking about framing, you're talking about scenes and going from perspectives and scenes and stuff like that. So a lot of the technical process of the artistic creation is more like film. It often is more episodic, like a TV show and things like that. But maybe it's just because I came at it from a prose side. In my mind, it's it's the story, it's these characters, it's the plot, and I'm breaking it down into pages. So for me, in my mind, it still feels more like a book.
You also don't draw it, though.
I also don't draw it. I'm sure my artist feels very differently. But just from the writing side of it, I'm writing, I don't know. Yeah. In some ways, it is a lot more like a film because, when I write it out, I write these brief scene descriptions and I write dialogue. I don't write it like prose anymore.
Well, this is a somewhat artificial distinction because all film also starts out as prose.
Yes.
All comics start out as prose. And then you add the visual element. Prose is kind of our baseline for almost everything. So, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say. Are comics closer to film than novels? Maybe in some ways. I feel like there's a very big difference in that a film is always going to be a massively collaborative effort. Both comics and novels can basically come from the mind of a single person, which again can be a strength and a weakness. You do end up with just such an amazing variety within, again, both novels and comics of the kind of plots you can do, the kind of stories you can tell that, I don't think we necessarily see in film, simply because you've got to kind of come together and you've got more pressure to financially succeed.
Well, it looks like we've run out of time for this episode. This program is a production of the Spiderforest Webcomic Collective. Our executive producer is Christina Major, and Eva is our showrunner and our audio engineer. The Spiderforest Webcomic Collective is a creator-owned organization funded by voluntary contributions from our members and from readers and listeners like you. Thanks for your support, and don't forget to go to spiderforest.com to read some of the over 70 webcomics written and drawn by our members. At spiderforest.com, you can also join the discussion on our forums, interact with our creators, and more. And as always, you can even click on support to make a donation. We're grateful for your assistance. It helps make our work possible, including things like this podcast. I'd like to thank Olga Makarova for joining us for this episode. You can read her comic Gifts of Wandering Ice in both Russian and English at mildegard.ru. Thanks also to Eva for bringing us that interview. I'd also like to thank Dan Kelly for bringing us this episode's discussion, as well as our members who participated, Kat Feete, Denise Randall, and Dan Sharp. Dan Kelly produces the comic Saffron Sage. You can read it at saffroncomic.com. Kat Feete produces the comic Sunset Grill. You can read it at sunsetgrillcomic.com. Denise Randall produces the comic Gemutations Plague. You can read it at gemutations.spiderforest.com. Dan Sharp produces the comic The Demon Archives. You can read it at demonarchives.com. And I'd like to add that he's also running a crowdfunding campaign for a print volume of The Demon Archives right now, and you still have time to get in on it. You can find it on Kickstarter, and we'll put a link at spiderforest.com. Eva produces the comic Bits Fair. You can read it at bitsfair.com. I produce the comic Six Commando. You can read it at viciousprint.com/sixcommando. And one final note, the Spiderforest Webcomic Collective is still open for new comics. Our August application season is open until August 22nd, 2017. So if you have a webcomic and you'd like to join us, go to spiderforest.com for details. I'm Matthew Moyen. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
I've seen a lot of comics, even big mainstream comics, that have long segments of just talking heads and monocolor backgrounds. So even if it's not the right thing to do, I think a lot of people do it, and it doesn't seem that readers really mind that much.
Yeah, and also a lot of times it depends on the type of comic, because a lot of the ones that are more like 3-panel comic sort of things, those backgrounds seem to those matter a little bit less sometimes than when you have the big long-form, huge graphic novel page, where, so it just depends. You have to be aware of what you're doing.
It also kind of depends on your readership.
Yeah.
My readership is terrible. They love background detail. And going back to pacing, that's something that people, you just have to know what people are like. They will love to pick up some tiny background detail and pounce on me in the comments about it and want me to expound upon the world and stuff. I should say that what I say about my audience is that there are people who thought the problem with Tolkien was he didn't write enough appendices. They're wonderful people.
He didn't describe the trees very enough.
Yes, no, they're wonderful people. I wouldn't trade them for the world.
No, don't start that. No, I hated that section.
But they do. You find different people in webcomics. Some people don't mind that there's no background and all, and it's all talking heads. And other people are like, so you said that this was set at such and such a time, but there's a clock on the background that's at such and such a time, and why do they even have this old style clock in 500 years in the future? And I'm like, because I didn't vet the set very well. I didn't look at it. I made something up. It was fun.
Overanalyze, yes.